welcome back to the Room of Requirement. I'm excited to bring this video to you today. So today we're going to be talking about the deeper truth of the spiritual path and how to navigate them without losing yourself. This is very important once you get a little bit further on the path. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. The path gets clearer and more confusing. So we always come across this on our spiritual path. The more we know, the more confused we get, the more questions that we have. But as the path does get clearer eventually, then it gets even more confusing because there's so much information out there. So I wanted to guide you guys through this today. Okay, so as you continue on your spiritual path, something begins to shift. What once felt complex starts to become simple, and what once felt solid begins to loosen. Certain insights begin to emerge, and identity, reality, perception, and meaning that feel undeniably true in the moment. These are often described as deeper truths, realizations, or awakenings. But what is rarely explained is that these truths, while real, are not stable when first encountered. And without understanding how to navigate them, they can create as much confusion as clarity. The deeper the truth, the more carefully it must be integrated. Truth appears before it stabilizes. On the path, truth is not received all at once. It appears in fragments, moments where something becomes clear, where perception shifts, or where a previously held assumption no longer holds. These moments can feel definitive, but they are not yet integrated. The practitioner is seeing something accurately, but from within a system that has not yet fully reorganized around it. This is where distortion begins, not because the truth is false, but because it is incomplete within the practitioner. You are not your thoughts. Truth number 1. At a certain point, the practitioner begins to experience a separation between awareness and thought. Thoughts continue to arise, but they are seen rather than believed. These realizations is foundational and often interpreted as a major shift. What this feels like is distance. Thoughts lose their immediate authority, and there is a sense of space between stimulus and response. The distortion occurs when this is taken as a final state. So the practitioner may begin to disengage from thought entirely or assume that all thought is irrelevant. In some cases, this leads to avoidance rather than clarity. So this is where a lot of people will kind of give up on what they believe is real, what they believe is true. They hear something, they read something, and then it completely just changes their thought process, and then they throw their hands up. Okay, so navigation requires integration. So if it's not integrated and thought over a long period of time, this is what starts to happen. So thought is not eliminated, it is placed in its correct position. The practitioner learns to use thought without being controlled by it. Truth 2. Identity is constructed. As awareness deepens, identity begins to loosen. Roles, beliefs, and self-concepts are seen as constructed rather than fixed. This can feel liberating, as the practitioner is no longer bound to a single narrative. What this feels like is fluidity, less attachment to who you think you are, and more openness in how you respond. The distortion occurs when identity is rejected entirely. The practitioner may feel ungrounded, disconnected, or unable to function in structured environments. In some cases, this leads to a form of detachment that is mistaken for freedom. Navigation requires balance. Identity is not removed, it becomes flexible. The practitioner learns to engage with identity when needed without being confined by it. Truth 3. Perception shapes reality. At a deeper level, the practitioner begins to see that how they perceive influences how they experience attention, expectation, and interpretation all play a role in shaping their reality. So what this feels like is increased agency, recognizing that internal state affects external experience. The distortion occurs when this is taken too far, leading to the belief that everything is controlled by perception. This can create unrealistic expectations or dismissal of external factors. Navigation requires precision. Perception influences experience, but does not replace reality. The practitioner learns to work with perception without denying external conditions. Truth 4. There is no fixed center. As practice deepens further, the sense of a fixed center or observer begins to shift. Awareness is no longer experienced as located in a specific point, but as something more diffuse. What this feels like is openness, less sense of being inside experience and more sense of being a part of it. This distortion occurs when this leads to distortion or loss of functional grounding. Without a stable reference point, the practitioner may feel detached or unclear. Navigation requires stability. The absence of a fixed center does not remove the need for functional orientation. The practitioner learns to operate without rigid identification while maintaining coherence. Truth 5. Most of what you experience is interpretation. At a certain stage, it becomes clear that much of what is experienced is filtered through interpretation. Sensations, thoughts, and events are constantly being shaped by meaning assigned to them. What this feels like is clarity, recognition that experience is not as objective as it once seemed. This distortion occurs when this leads to doubt or dismissal of all experience. The practitioner may begin to question everything to the point of instability. Navigation requires discernment. Interpretation is always present, but it can be refined. The practitioner learns to observe interpretation without being controlled by it. Advanced truth number 6. There is no separation, non-dual perception. At a certain depth of practice, the practitioner begins to perceive that the separation between self and experience is not as solid as it once appeared. The boundary between observer and observed becomes less defined, and there can be moments where experience feels unified rather than divided. This is often described as non-duality. What this feels like is openness and immediacy. Experience is no longer filtered through a strong sense of I am here and that is there, but instead appears as a continuous field. There can be a sense of ease because the tension created by separation begins to dissolve. The distortion occurs when this is interpreted as a permanent state or used to dismiss functional reality. The practitioner may begin to ignore boundaries, responsibilities, or distinctions that are still necessary for practical functioning. In some cases, this leads to confusion rather than clarity. Navigation requires precision. Non-dual perception does not eliminate functional distinction, it reveals that distinction is not absolute. The practitioner learns to operate within structure while no longer being confined by it. Advanced Truth 7. Time is not experienced the way that you think. As perception refines, the experience of time begins to shift. The practitioner may notice that past and future are largely constructed through thought, while actual experience occurs only in the present. This is often encountered as a realization that time is not as linear or fixed as it appears. What this feels like is compression or expansion. Moments may feel longer, shorter, or less defined. There may be a sense that experience is unfolding without the same rigid sense of sequence. The distortion occurs when this is taken to mean that time does not exist or doesn't matter. The practitioner may begin to disregard structure, planning, or cause and effect in practical life, leading to disorganization. Navigation requires grounding, while time may be perceived differently. functional time still operates, the practitioner learns to hold both direct experience of the present and practical engagement with sequence. Advanced Truth 8. Causation is more complex than it appears. At deeper levels, the practitioner begins to see that cause and effect are not always linear. Internal states, perception, and external events interact in ways that are not immediately obvious. This can create the impression that reality is more fluid or interconnected than previously understood. What this feels like is increased sensitivity to patterns. The practitioner may notice connections between internal state and external experience that were previously overlooked. The distortion occurs when this becomes overextended into the belief that everything is directly controlled by thought or intention. This leads to misinterpretation, where correlation is mistaken for causation. Navigation requires restraint. The practitioner recognizes influence without assuming total control. Reality is interactive, not entirely self-generated. Advanced Truth 2. Silence is not absence, it is structure. As practice deepens, there are periods where mental activity reduces significantly, and what remains is a form of silence. This silence is often interrupted as emptiness or nothingness, but in reality, it is a different form of structure, one that is not filled with constant thought. What this feels like is stillness, but also clarity. There is less internal noise, and perception becomes more direct. The distortion occurs when the practitioner becomes attached to silence itself, attempting to maintain it or return it to its preferred state. This creates effort and tension, which disrupts the very thing being sought. Navigation requires non-attachment. Silence is not something to hold on to, it is something that appears when conditions allow. The practitioner learns to function with or without it. Advanced Truth 2. Nothing you experience is final. At a certain stage, it becomes clear that every realization, every insight, and every perceived truth is part of an ongoing process. What feels complete at one stage is later seen as partial. What this feels like is humility. The practitioner begins to recognize that certainty is temporary and that understanding evolves over time. This distortion occurs when this leads to doubt or dismissal of all insight. The practitioner may begin to question everything to the point of paralysis, and I've had this happen to me numerous times. Navigation requires balance. Insights are not rejected, they are held lightly. The practitioner uses them without becoming fixed within them. Advanced Truth 11. The path becomes less about experience and more about being. In the earlier stages, practice is often measured by what is experienced, clarity, energy, insight, or change. At deeper levels, this begins to shift. What matters is no longer what happens during the practice, but how the practitioner exists across all conditions. What this feels like is simplicity. There is less need for validation through experience and more emphasis of consistency and stability. The distortion occurs when the practitioner believes nothing is happening because there are fewer noticeable experiences, but in reality, development has moved to a deeper level. Navigation requires trust in the process, and the absence of intensity is not absence, it is often a sign of stabilization. The pattern, why these truths become unstable. Each of these truths is accurate, but none of them are complete when first realized. They represent shifts in perception that must be integrated into a system that is still developing. Without integration, they create imbalance. The pattern is consistent. A truth is seen, it is over-applied, it creates distortion, and then it must be corrected through experience and stability. If you have ever had an insight that felt completely true, only to later realize it created confusion or imbalance, this is not failure, it is part of the process. You saw something real, but you had not yet stabilized within it. How to navigate deeper truths. Stabilization over interpretation. The key to navigating these truths is not to analyze them endlessly, but to allow them to stabilize over time. This means continuing practice, observing how these realizations affect behavior and perception, and not rushing to conclusions. A truth that is real will remain, but it will change in how it is understood. The deeper truths of the path are not endpoints, they are transitions. Each one reveals something real, but also requires refinement. The path is not about collecting insights, but about becoming stable within what is seen. Final closing. As you move deeper into your spiritual path, the truths you encounter will become more subtle, more precise, and at times more destabilizing. Not because they are incorrect, but because they are revealing aspects of reality that the current structure of the mind is not yet fully prepared to hold. These truths are not meant to be grasped all at once or applied immediately, but to be lived with, observed, and gradually integrated until they become stable rather than disruptive. When approached this way, the path shifts from the series of realizations into a process of refinement, where each insight becomes less about what you understand in the moment and more about what you are able to remain within over time. And it is through that stability that once felt like fleeting clarity becomes something that is no longer needs to be held, because it has become part of how you see and exist. Okay, you guys, I hope you enjoy that one. I know that one was a little deep, and it happens at different stages on the path. I've had it to me quite a bit, and you will too, as you move down your path and start to realize, these deeper truths, these deeper concepts. You'll believe in something a couple months, and then a couple months later you'll change your mind because you need time to integrate it. So these things are going to happen repeatedly on your path, and they're nothing to be afraid of or get disillusioned about or get rid of. It's just a natural part of the path. Okay, you guys, so I will see you guys next time. I hope you enjoyed this one. Bye.